You really thought you belonged at this table? The words barely left Ethan Whitmore's mouth before the deep red arc of Cabernet left his glass and spread across Naomi Carter's black silk dress like a slow-burning accusation. The private dining room at Le Claire in downtown Manhattan had been quiet just seconds earlier. Polished marble floors, low golden light, crystal glasses catching reflections from the skyline 40 floors up. Now the silence cracked, not from shock, but from laughter. Ethan leaned back in his chair, expensive cufflinks glinting, his grin wide and careless. His mother, Victoria Whitmore, covered her mouth as she laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they think there will be no consequences. His father, Richard Whitmore, billionaire developer and founder of Whitmore Holdings, shook his head with indulgent amusement. "Relax," Ethan said, setting the empty glass down as if he'd just knocked over water at a backyard barbecue. "Dry cleaning exists." Naomi didn't move. Not at first. The wine dripped slowly from the edge of her sleeve to the polished hardwood floor. A waiter froze mid-step. A junior associate from Whitmore's team stared at his plate. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city pulsed, yellow cabs inching through traffic, steam rising from grates, the hum of a Tuesday night in America's financial capital. Inside, the air changed. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was charged. Naomi Carter sat at the end of the 12-seat table, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on either side of her plate. She wore no flashy jewelry, no designer logo screaming for attention, just a tailored black dress and a slim gold watch. To anyone who didn't know better, she could have been a mid-level consultant invited to observe. That was the assumption Ethan had made. That was the assumption his parents had silently agreed with the moment she walked in alone. Victoria tilted her head and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, honey," she said, voice smooth as chilled champagne. "These dinners can be overwhelming if you're not used to them." Richard added, "Let's try to keep things professional. Aurora Capital is sending senior leadership later this week. Tonight is just preliminary discussion." Preliminary. The word hung there like a polite dismissal. Naomi reached for her napkin. She dabbed at the wine carefully, methodically, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked patient. At the far end of the table, Daniel Brooks, a 28-year-old financial analyst fresh out of Wharton, felt his throat tighten. He knew that name. Naomi Carter. He'd seen it on Bloomberg terminals, in earnings calls, on the cover of Forbes 6 months ago under the headline Quiet Power. CEO of Aurora Capital, the private equity firm that controlled the $650 million lifeline Whitmore Holdings desperately needed to close its largest mixed-use development in Miami, 6 city blocks, 2 luxury towers, projected revenue north of $2.4 billion over 10 years. Daniel's eyes darted from Naomi to Richard, waiting for someone else to recognize what he had. No one did. Or if they did, they weren't speaking. Ethan leaned forward again, elbows on the table. "You're awfully calm," he said. "Most people would be upset." Naomi finally looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "Most people," she replied softly, "aren't here by accident." A faint crease formed between Richard's brows. "Excuse me?" he asked. Naomi's gaze shifted to him. "I said I'm exactly where I intended to be." Victoria gave a small laugh, dismissive. "Confidence is important," she said, lifting her wineglass. "Even when it's misplaced." A server stepped closer with a clean napkin, hesitating. Naomi nodded her thanks and continued blotting the stain. The red against black was dramatic, but not catastrophic. It would wash out. Across the table, Ethan checked his phone, clearly bored. "Dad, are we done here?" he muttered. "If the real decision-makers aren't even in the room yet, what's the point?" Richard exhaled slowly. "The point," he said, "is relationship building. Aurora doesn't move without due diligence." He glanced back at Naomi. "Which is why we appreciate you sitting in." Sitting in. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Naomi leaned back in her chair, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. For a moment, the room seemed to slow. The clink of silverware from another table outside the private suite. The distant hum of traffic 40 floors below. She remembered another room, 15 years earlier. A conference table in Atlanta. A different developer. A different dismissive smile. "We just don't see the fit," that man had said, sliding her proposal back across the table without reading past the first page. She had been 28 then, the youngest managing director in her firm's history, and still somehow invisible. The memory flickered and disappeared. She returned to the present. You're right about one thing, Naomi said calmly. Aurora doesn't move without due diligence. Richard nodded, satisfied, assuming agreement. Exactly. Ethan smirked. So maybe next time we're something less assistant level. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. The sound was small, but in the heavy air it felt like a crack of thunder. Ethan glanced at him. You good, man? Daniel swallowed. Yeah. He stopped. The right words hovered on his tongue, but fear pressed them back down. Naomi didn't rescue him. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her clutch and placed her phone gently on the table. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just deliberate. She tapped the screen once. The movement was subtle enough that most people didn't notice. Richard was mid-sentence about projected occupancy rates when his own phone vibrated. He glanced down absently, expecting a text from his CFO. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Then it changed completely. The color drained from his face as he reread the notification. Victoria leaned toward him. What is it? She whispered. Ethan rolled his eyes. What now? Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked across the table at Naomi, really looked at her for the first time. This says, he began slowly, that Aurora Capital has paused final review on the Miami project pending internal reassessment. Ethan frowned. So? That's just paperwork. Naomi folded her hands on the table. It's not paperwork, she said. It's protocol. The room tightened again. Daniel felt his pulse in his ears. Richard cleared his throat. Internal reassessment can take weeks, he said carefully. We're scheduled to close in 10 days. Naomi corrected, her tone still even. Victoria set her glass down too quickly, the stem rattling against the table. I'm sorry, she said, forcing a smile. Who exactly are you to speak on Aurora's timeline? Naomi held her gaze without blinking. I'm the person who decides it. Silence fell, heavy and undeniable. Even Ethan stopped moving. For a second, no one laughed. No one smirked. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system above them. Daniel found his voice at last, barely above a whisper. She's Naomi Carter. Ethan scoffed reflexively. And I'm Warren Buffett. But Richard wasn't laughing. He was staring at Naomi as recognition settled in like a storm cloud. The Forbes cover. The earnings call clip. The photo from the Aspen Summit. It was all there, rearranging itself in his mind. He started. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Yes. Victoria's hand trembled against the table. Ethan looked from his father to Naomi, confusion replacing arrogance. Wait, he said, half laughing. You're saying she's the CEO? Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You poured wine on the CEO, she said softly. And your parents laughed. No one spoke. The skyline outside seemed sharper now, harsher. Richard straightened in his chair, scrambling for footing. Ms. Carter, he began. If this is about a misunderstanding, it's not, she replied. It's about assessment. Ethan opened his mouth again, but the confidence was gone. This is crazy. It was a joke. Naomi looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. A $650 million decision, she said, is not a joke. Her phone lit up again. She didn't check it. She already knew what it said. Aurora Capital's internal memo had been issued. Funding suspended pending executive review. In 10 seconds, Whitmore Holdings' most important deal of the decade had shifted from inevitable to uncertain. And no one in that room could pretend it was an accident anymore. By 9:30 tomorrow morning, this city will know exactly what tonight cost you. Naomi Carter's voice did not rise when she said it. It did not need to. She had stopped walking just short of the private dining room exit, one hand resting lightly on the polished brass handle, the skyline still glowing behind her through 40 floors of glass. Richard Whitmore remained seated for half a second too long, as if refusing to accept the shift in gravity inside the room. Then he stood, not abruptly, not angrily, but urgently. Naomi, he said, dropping the formal tone now that he understood the ground beneath him had moved. Wait. She turned slowly. Her expression was not cold. It was clear. We can fix this, Richard continued. Whatever this looks like from your side, it does not represent our leadership. Ethan shifted in his chair. Dad, not now, Richard snapped quietly, then returned his focus to Naomi. You know how these dinners are. Tension. Ego. People make mistakes. Naomi studied him for a moment, as if measuring the distance between influence and accountability. Your son did not mistake my name, she said evenly. He mistook my presence. Victoria Whitmore rose next, smoothing the front of her designer jacket, her earlier composure replaced by calculation. We had no idea you were attending personally, she said carefully. If we had known, Naomi interrupted gently. That is exactly the problem. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Daniel Brooks watched from the edge of the table, feeling as though he was witnessing a negotiation that extended far beyond capital and contracts. The wine stain on Naomi's dress had dried into a deep maroon shadow. It no longer looked like an accident. It looked like evidence. Richard stepped around the table, closing some of the distance between them. Aurora Capital has been evaluating this partnership for 6 months, he said. We have delivered every projection, every audit, every stress test you requested. The Miami development is solid. The land acquisition is complete. Zoning is approved. If you withdraw now, lenders will question our stability. That uncertainty spreads fast. Naomi nodded once. It does. Ethan let out a frustrated breath. This is not about stability, he said. This is about pride. Naomi turned to him fully now. You believe pride costs $650 million? She asked. No, Ethan shot back. I believe ego does. The room tightened again. Victoria stepped between them verbally. Let us focus, she said. Naomi, what would it take to restore confidence? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked back toward the table, each step deliberate, controlled. She did not sit. She stood at the head of the table where Richard had been moments earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Aurora Capital invests in leadership teams, she began. We invest in governance. We invest in culture. When we attach our name to a development, pension funds and municipal boards assume oversight. They assume integrity. Richard nodded quickly. And you have that from us. Naomi's eyes shifted briefly to Ethan. Do I? The question was not loud. It was surgical. Daniel swallowed. He could see it unfolding now, not as retaliation, but as assessment. Richard followed her gaze to his son. Ethan is not involved in daily operations, he said quickly. He does not sit on the executive board. Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. He sits at your table, she replied. Ethan stood abruptly, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous, he said. You are rewriting reality over a dinner mishap. Naomi remained still. Reality rewrites itself, she said softly, when character reveals itself. Richard felt the temperature in the room drop, though the thermostat had not moved. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it this time. He understood the rhythm now. Aurora was not improvising. Aurora was executing. If this is about perception, he said carefully, we can issue a public statement reaffirming our partnership. We can highlight diversity initiatives, community investment. We can make this stronger than before. Naomi's gaze did not waver. Community investment is not a press release, she said. It is behavior when no one is recording. Victoria exhaled slowly. You are making this personal. Leadership is personal, Naomi answered. Capital is trust. Ethan shook his head. You are proving my point, he said. You are using power to punish. Naomi turned to him with something almost like pity. Power reveals, she said. It does not punish. Daniel felt his pulse steady. The difference between the two was becoming clear. Naomi reached into her clutch and removed a slim folder, placing it on the table. It was not dramatic. It was procedural. Aurora's executive committee voted unanimously, she said. Funding is suspended pending governance review. Richard stared at the folder without touching it. Governance review, he repeated. Of what? Naomi looked at him steadily. Succession planning. Executive oversight. Board accountability. Victoria's expression shifted from concern to alarm. You are suggesting structural changes? Naomi did not blink. I am suggesting alignment. Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to control our company? No, Naomi replied calmly. I want to understand who does. The sentence settled heavily. Richard felt the implication land. If Aurora remained in the deal, conditions would follow. Oversight. Influence. Perhaps a seat on the board. He had negotiated hostile takeovers before. He recognized leverage when he saw it. You are leveraging this moment, he said quietly. Naomi inclined her head slightly. You created the moment. Silence again. The skyline outside continued to shimmer, indifferent to the conversation unfolding above it. Daniel realized that in business school, they called this inflection, a point where trajectory changed permanently. Victoria tried once more. Naomi, she said, softer now, almost pleading. We have spent decades building Whitmore Holdings. We have thousands of employees, families who depend on these projects. This development revitalizes 6 city blocks. Retail, housing, jobs. Do not let one evening undo that. Naomi listened, truly listened. Then she spoke carefully. I am not undoing anything, she said. I am deciding whether Aurora attaches its name to leadership that understands responsibility. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly. You are never going to let this go, he said. Naomi met his gaze directly. I do not have to, she replied. Markets will. Richard finally opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet outlining next steps. Independent governance audit. Temporary funding freeze. Executive review meeting within 72 hours. He felt the weight of each bullet point. If we comply, he asked slowly, funding resumes? Naomi considered him. If alignment is demonstrated, she said. Yes. Victoria's eyes flicked to Ethan. Ethan noticed. Do not look at me, he said. You are not making me the scapegoat. Naomi's voice remained level. No one is asking you to be a scapegoat, she said. But accountability is not a performance. It is a decision. Daniel felt the room narrow around that word. Decision. Richard closed the folder gently. You are asking for leadership restructuring, he said. Possibly. Including my son, Richard pressed. Naomi did not hesitate. Including anyone who represents unchecked liability. Ethan inhaled sharply. You cannot remove me from my own company. Naomi's expression did not change. I cannot, she agreed. But capital can. The simplicity of it stunned the room. Victoria placed a hand on Ethan's arm, but he pulled away. Richard looked at his son, then back at Naomi. He saw the future branching in front of him. Protect pride. Or protect the company. He had made ruthless decisions before in business. Tonight felt different. Not ruthless. Necessary. Give us until tomorrow afternoon, he said finally. We will convene the board at 8 o'clock in the morning. We will review governance structure. We will present a response by 2 p.m. Eastern. Naomi nodded once. That is reasonable. Ethan stared at his father. You are serious? Richard did not look at him. This is no longer about dinner, he said quietly. Naomi stepped back toward the door again. It never was, she replied. She paused one last time. Respect costs nothing, she said. But disrespect is rarely affordable. The words settled into the air like a final entry in a ledger. She opened the door and walked out into the softly lit hallway, heels steady against the marble floor. Inside the private dining room, the Whitmore family remained. Standing, no longer laughing, no longer certain. Daniel Brooks looked at the skyline once more and understood that by the time the sun rose over Manhattan, one of the most powerful families in real estate would face a choice they had never been forced to make before. And the woman they had underestimated would be waiting for their answer. The market opens in 3 hours, Richard Whitmore said quietly, staring at the dark skyline from the floor to ceiling window of his penthouse office. It was just after 6:30 in the morning. Manhattan was shifting from night to motion, headlights giving way to sunlight, delivery trucks replacing late-night town cars. Behind him, the Whitmore Holdings executive board sat in tense silence around a 12-foot walnut conference table. No one had slept much. Naomi Carter had not either, but she did not look tired. She stood in her own glass-walled office 15 blocks away, a fresh black suit replacing the wine-stained dress from the night before. The stain had come out in the dry cleaning process. The lesson had not. Monica Hayes stood across from her, tablet in hand. Whitmore board convened at 8 o'clock sharp, Monica reported. Their legal counsel joined remotely. Market chatter is building. 2 analysts flagged uncertainty in pre-market notes. Naomi nodded once. Have we received their formal response? Not yet, Monica said. But sources say internal tension is high. Naomi turned toward the window. The early sunlight caught the Hudson River in a sharp silver line. Of course it is, she said softly. Accountability always feels like tension before it feels like relief. Across town, the Whitmore board meeting had shifted from defensive to desperate within minutes. We cannot lose Aurora, one director insisted. Our credit facilities are structured around that partnership. Another added. If the suspension holds past this week, lenders will reevaluate exposure. Richard remained standing at the head of the table, hands resting on the back of his chair. Ethan sat halfway down the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. This is an overreaction, Ethan said. We are letting one dinner define 30 years of performance. A senior board member leaned forward. No, he said carefully. We are letting risk define valuation. The room quieted. Richard finally spoke. Naomi Carter is not bluffing, he said. Aurora's executive committee voted unanimously. That means institutional investors are watching. Ethan shook his head. So what? We apologize. We issue a statement. We move on. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. It is not about apology, he said quietly. It is about control. Silence fell again. The board understood the subtext. Aurora Capital's suspension was not merely punitive. It was leverage. Back at Aurora's headquarters, Naomi walked into the executive conference room at 8:45. The Aurora Executive Committee was already assembled. 5 members. Seasoned. Calculated. Calm. Whitmore response pending, Naomi began. We will not speculate. We will evaluate. One committee member adjusted his glasses. Public sentiment? He asked. Monica tapped her screen. Social chatter minimal, she said. This remains internal for now. Naomi nodded. Good, she said. This is not about spectacle. She paused. It is about standards. At 9:28 a.m. Eastern, Richard's phone buzzed again. The boardroom clock ticked loudly in the silence. He looked down. Incoming call. Naomi Carter. He inhaled once before answering. Good morning, he said. Naomi's voice came through steady and composed. Good morning, Richard. Has your board reached a decision? He glanced around the table. Every face waited. Ethan stared directly at him, defiant. Richard swallowed. We have, he said. And? Naomi asked. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Effective immediately, he said. Ethan Whitmore will step down from any advisory or public representation role within Whitmore Holdings. Additionally, we will appoint 2 independent directors to the board within 30 days. Full governance review to follow. The words felt heavy. Final. Ethan's chair scraped against the floor. You cannot be serious, he said, voice rising. This is my company. Richard did not look at him. It is our company, he corrected quietly. On the other end of the call, Naomi listened without interruption. She did not smile. She did not gloat. That is a start, she said. Ethan stood fully now. You are sacrificing me for optics, he snapped. A board member spoke firmly. This is not optics. This is survival. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Naomi, he said, we are prepared to formalize this in writing within the hour. Naomi glanced at Monica, who gave a subtle nod. Aurora will review the documentation immediately, Naomi replied. Pending confirmation, funding suspension will lift at 2 p.m. Eastern. Relief rippled across the Whitmore boardroom like air returning after pressure. Ethan stared at his father. In disbelief. All this because of her, he said under his breath. Richard turned to him slowly. No, he said. All this because of you. Silence swallowed the room. At 1:58 p.m. Eastern, Aurora Capital issued a quiet internal update. Funding suspension lifted. Governance conditions accepted. By 2:15, analyst chatter shifted from uncertainty to recalibrated confidence. Whitmore Holdings stock, which had dipped 2% in pre-market anxiety, stabilized. No press conference. No headlines. Just movement in spreadsheets and decisions recorded in board minutes. In her office, Naomi watched the numbers adjust on her screen. Monica stepped in. Confirmation received, she said. Independent directors named. Ethan officially removed from public representation. Naomi nodded once. Good, she said. She walked to the window again, the afternoon light brighter now, the city fully alive. 15 years earlier, she had stood outside another boardroom, hearing her name dismissed as a risk. That memory surfaced briefly, then faded. She turned back toward her desk. There was work to do. Across town, Ethan packed a leather portfolio into a box in his private office overlooking Park Avenue. No one spoke to him. The silence was not hostile. It was transactional. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at the framed photos of groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. For the first time, he understood what leverage felt like from the other side. Richard stood alone in the boardroom long after everyone had left. He stared at the skyline that had once felt entirely within his control. His phone buzzed again. A message from Naomi. Governance is not punishment, it read. It is protection. He read it twice. Then he typed back a single sentence. Understood. That evening, Daniel Brooks sat at his small apartment desk in Queens, replaying the past 24 hours in his mind. He had seen arrogance collapse into accountability in less than a day. He had watched capital enforce character. He opened his laptop and began drafting a memo for his own files, not about the numbers, but about the lesson. In Midtown, Naomi closed her office at 7 p.m. The skyline had shifted from daylight to dusk again. Another day in Manhattan. Another negotiation concluded. As she stepped into the elevator, Monica asked quietly, "Do you ever hesitate?" Naomi considered the question for a moment. Hesitate? About pulling the trigger, Monica clarified. Naomi shook her head. Slightly. No, she said. When respect is optional, trust becomes impossible. The elevator doors closed softly. Outside, traffic moved in steady streams of red and white lights. In one building, a father had chosen his company over his son's ego. In another, a chief executive had chosen standards over convenience. The market would not remember the dinner. It would remember the decision. And somewhere in the quiet space between leverage and leadership, the cost of one careless assumption had been calculated in full. Power does not raise its voice. It adjusts the room. The sentence appeared on the internal Aurora Capital leadership memo the following Monday morning, signed simply N. Carter. By 8:15 a.m. Eastern, the Miami development call was underway, this time not in a private dining room, but across two polished boardrooms connected by secure video conference. On one side, Aurora Capital's executive committee sat composed, screens displaying projections, compliance updates, and governance timelines. On the other, Whitmore Holdings' newly restructured leadership team sat noticeably altered. Two independent directors occupied seats that had been empty a week earlier. Ethan Whitmore's chair was gone. Richard Whitmore looked older than he had 7 days prior, not physically diminished, but recalibrated. The skyline behind him was the same. His posture was not. Naomi Carter's image filled the central screen at Aurora's end of the table. Black blazer. Crisp white blouse. Calm eyes. She did not reference the dinner. She did not reference the stain. She began with numbers. Phase 1 capital allocation will resume immediately, she said evenly. $75 million released upon documentation of board restructuring, which we have received. Remaining tranches contingent on quarterly governance review. Richard nodded. Understood. The words came without resistance. One of the newly appointed independent directors, a former federal compliance advisor named Margaret Ellis, leaned toward her microphone. We welcome the oversight, she said. Transparency benefits everyone. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Agreed. The tone of the room was no longer defensive. It was disciplined. Daniel Brooks, seated 3 chairs down from Richard, watched the exchange carefully. He had not spoken during the previous week's crisis, but he had listened to every conversation since. Analysts had called. Lenders had inquired. Investors had demanded reassurance. Whitmore Holdings had survived the tremor. Now it was rebuilding credibility in real time. Construction timeline remains intact, Daniel said when prompted, his voice steady. Groundbreaking remains. Scheduled for September 15th. Labor contracts confirmed. Supply chain stable. Naomi nodded once. Aurora will send a compliance liaison to your headquarters for the next 90 days, she said. Not as an adversary. As alignment. Richard met her gaze through the screen. We appreciate that. He meant it. The call concluded in under 40 minutes. No raised voices. No sarcasm. Just recalibrated power dynamics recorded in official minutes. After the screens went dark, Richard remained seated. The new directors gathered their folders quietly. Daniel lingered. Sir, he said carefully. Richard looked up. Yes. Daniel hesitated, then spoke plainly. We almost lost everything because no one thought there would be consequences. Richard held his gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. We did. Across town, Naomi stepped out of the Aurora conference room into the hallway lined with framed covers of financial magazines. Forbes, Fortune, Institutional Investor. Her own face appeared on one of them, under the headline The Quiet Architect. She paused briefly in front of it, not out of pride, but out of reflection. 15 years earlier, She had sat outside a boardroom waiting to be invited in. Now she controlled entry. Monica Hayes approached with her tablet. Media inquiry from the Financial Ledger, Monica said. They heard about Whitmore's board restructuring. They are asking if Aurora influenced it. Naomi considered for a moment. Tell them governance is a shared priority, she replied. No comment beyond that. Monica nodded and stepped away. Naomi walked toward her office, heels measured against the marble floor. The city hummed outside, unaware of the recalibration that had taken place in its towers. Later that afternoon, Ethan Whitmore sat alone at a private club in Midtown, staring at a glass of untouched water. No wine. No laughter. His phone had stopped buzzing days ago. Friends who once praised his confidence now offered vague encouragement about new ventures. He replayed the dinner in his mind, searching for the exact second the room shifted. He had believed power was inherited. He had mistaken access for authority. Now he understood the difference. Back at Whitmore Holdings, Margaret Ellis convened her first governance committee session. We are not here to erase history, she said to the assembled executives. We are here to prevent repetition. The room listened carefully. For the first time in years, Whitmore's internal meetings included language about accountability metrics and behavioral standards alongside revenue projections. Culture was no longer implied. It was documented. That evening, Richard stood once again at the window of his office overlooking Manhattan. The skyline looked unchanged, but he saw it differently now. Buildings were not monuments. They were responsibilities. His phone buzzed. A message from Naomi. Progress is measured quietly, it read. He typed back after a pause. Understood. Across town, Naomi closed her office at 6:30 p.m. She walked past the reception desk where a young intern looked up at her with admiration. Long week? The intern asked. Naomi offered a small smile. Productive, she replied. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Calm, controlled, composed. The stain from the previous week was gone, but the memory remained sharp, not as anger, but as affirmation. In Queens, Daniel Brooks sat at his kitchen table reviewing compliance updates. His small apartment overlooked the elevated train tracks, the rumble of passing cars a steady rhythm in the background. He opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. Respect is not a courtesy. It is capital. He closed the notebook with a quiet sense of clarity. Weeks passed. The Miami development broke ground on schedule under bright September sunlight. Hard hats replaced dinner jackets. Shovels replaced wine glasses. Aurora Capital's logo stood alongside Whitmore Holdings on the construction banners. Cameras flashed as officials posed for photographs. Richard delivered a brief speech about partnership and responsibility. Naomi stood to the side, observing. When asked to speak, she stepped to the podium without flourish. This project represents investment, she said simply. Investment in infrastructure, in jobs, in community. But more importantly, it represents alignment. Alignment between vision and conduct. Applause followed, steady and measured. She stepped back without elaboration. Later, as guests dispersed and construction crews prepared equipment, Richard approached her privately. You were right, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him. About unchecked behavior, he replied. It was expensive. Naomi nodded once. It usually is. There was no hostility in the exchange. Only acknowledgement. As she walked back toward her car, the Miami heat rising from the pavement, she felt no triumph. Only confirmation. Leadership was not about humiliation or revenge. It was about standards applied consistently, even when inconvenient. In Manhattan, markets continued to open and close each day at 9:30 and 4 p.m. Eastern. Spreadsheets updated. Projects advanced. Names rose and fell. But in one private dining room weeks earlier, a moment of careless laughter had revealed something far larger than embarrassment. It had revealed leverage. And leverage, when guided by principle, did not shout. It adjusted the room. 3 months ago, you would have laughed, Richard Whitmore said quietly as he stood beside Naomi Carter on the observation deck overlooking the Miami development site. The morning sun reflected off steel beams rising into the blue Florida sky. Construction crews moved with steady coordination below, orange vests bright against fresh concrete. The sound of machinery hummed like controlled momentum. Naomi did not look at him immediately. She watched the cranes pivot slowly above them, deliberate and balanced. 3 months ago, she replied calmly. I would have still made the same decision. Richard nodded once, accepting that truth without resistance. The groundbreaking ceremony had long ended. The cameras were gone. The speeches had been recorded and archived. What remained was structure, literal and institutional. Whitmore Holdings had not only added 2 independent directors, but implemented internal leadership reviews across all divisions. Margaret Ellis had expanded compliance training to include behavioral accountability modules. Daniel Brooks had been promoted to a governance liaison position, bridging communication between Aurora Capital and Whitmore Holdings. Culture was no longer implied through reputation. It was measured. Ethan Whitmore was not present at the site. He had relocated temporarily to Los Angeles, exploring what he publicly called entrepreneurial ventures. Privately, he was learning what distance from inherited power felt like. The markets had stabilized. Analysts had revised their commentary. The Miami project moved forward, now described in financial newsletters as an example of recalibrated corporate discipline. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the railing. The breeze carried the scent of ocean air mixed with construction dust. You adjusted, she said simply. Richard looked at the rising structure below. I had to, he admitted. You gave us a choice. Naomi turned slightly toward him. I gave you alignment, she corrected. He exhaled slowly. At a cost. Naomi met his eyes calmly. Every correction has one. The conversation did not carry tension anymore. It carried recognition. Weeks earlier, their interactions had been charged with leverage. Now they were shaped by clarity. Across the site, Daniel stood with a tablet in hand, reviewing updated compliance reports from subcontractors. He moved differently now. Not anxious. Not hesitant. Purposeful. He had learned that silence in the face of misjudgment was complicity. He no longer intended to be silent. Back in Manhattan that same afternoon, Aurora Capital hosted its quarterly leadership summit in a glass auditorium overlooking the Hudson River. Senior partners, analysts, and associates filled the seats. Naomi stood at the podium beneath a simple projection screen displaying one word, standards. She did not reference names. She did not narrate events. She spoke about alignment between authority and conduct. Leadership, she said evenly, is tested when no one believes they are being evaluated. Capital follows confidence, but confidence is built on consistency. The room remained silent, absorbing each sentence. Monica Hayes stood at the side of the stage, watching the audience. She knew the subtext. Everyone did. Naomi continued. Respect is not about visibility. It is about behavior. And behavior, when unchecked, compounds risk. A few heads nodded subtly. Several junior associates glanced at one another, recognizing the lesson. When the session ended, applause followed not as spectacle, but as affirmation. Afterward, a young analyst approached Naomi near the back of the auditorium. How do you know when to intervene? The analyst asked carefully. Naomi paused, considering the question. When silence would cost more than action, she replied. The answer settled quietly. Later that evening, in a private club in Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore sat across from a venture capitalist reviewing a pitch deck. He spoke with measured enthusiasm, referencing market opportunity and projected returns. The investor listened politely. When the meeting ended, the investor offered constructive feedback, but no immediate commitment. Ethan walked outside into the California sun and checked his phone. No new messages from Manhattan. No invitations. He had once believed influence was permanent. Now he understood it required stewardship. Back in Miami, the skeleton of the first tower reached 20 stories high within weeks. Workers moved in synchronized patterns, guided by plans reviewed and re-reviewed by oversight committees. Margaret Ellis conducted her third governance audit, noting improved transparency metrics and revised executive reporting structures. Sustainable, she wrote in her assessment. The word carried weight. One afternoon, Richard visited Aurora Capital's headquarters in person. He stepped into Naomi's office overlooking Midtown. No cameras. No audience. Just 2 leaders seated across a polished desk. You could have walked away entirely, he said. Naomi folded her hands calmly. Yes, she agreed. Why did you? Not, he asked. She considered briefly. Because the project had value, she said. And so did the opportunity to recalibrate leadership. Richard nodded slowly. You changed the trajectory of my company. Naomi held his gaze. You changed it, she replied. I simply made the misalignment visible. He sat back in his chair, absorbing the distinction. Months earlier, he would have interpreted her firmness as aggression. Now he recognized it as precision. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. For what it is worth, he said quietly, my son has started attending governance workshops in California. Naomi did not smile. She simply nodded. Growth is available, she said, if pursued. After he left, Monica stepped in with updated market summaries. Whitmore stock up 3% since last quarter, she reported. Analysts citing improved oversight. Naomi glanced at the chart briefly. Good, she said. That is the goal. She returned to her work, reviewing infrastructure investments in Chicago and renewable energy portfolios in Texas. The Miami situation was no longer a crisis. It was precedent. Weeks turned into months. The first Miami tower neared completion, its glass facade reflecting the Atlantic in bright fragments. Whitmore Holdings held a shareholder meeting unlike any in its history. Independent directors presented governance updates. Margaret Ellis outlined compliance benchmarks. Richard acknowledged the recalibration openly. We learned, he said before the assembled investors. And we adjusted. Applause followed, not exuberant, but steady. In Queens, Daniel Brooks attended the shareholder meeting virtually, watching the evolution unfold on his laptop. He remembered the dinner, the laughter, the assumption, and the silence that followed when consequences arrived. He closed his laptop after the meeting and looked out at the city skyline in the distance. Structures rose and fell, but principles endured. One evening, months after the original dinner, Naomi returned briefly to L'Eau Claire for a separate engagement. She walked through the same entrance, past the same polished marble floors, under the same golden lighting. A maitre d' recognized her immediately and greeted her with quiet respect. She did not pause. She did not linger. She took her seat at a different table, across from a different leadership team, discussing a renewable energy acquisition. The conversation centered on projections, oversight, and shared standards. No wine was spilled. No laughter carried condescension. Just measured negotiation. As she left the restaurant later that night, the city air cool against her face, she reflected not on humiliation, but on correction. She did not need revenge. She had required alignment. And alignment, when enforced calmly and precisely, reshaped rooms without raising its voice. In Manhattan, Miami, and Los Angeles, decisions continued to ripple outward. Some learned quickly, some learned slowly. But the cost of careless assumptions had been recorded clearly in the ledger of one family's recalibration. And in the quiet architecture of power, that record would not be forgotten. Reputation is rebuilt the same way it is broken, Naomi Carter said quietly as she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Aurora Capital's executive lounge, watching a winter storm roll across Manhattan. One decision at a time. 6 months had passed since the night in the private dining room. The Miami towers now stood fully enclosed in glass, reflecting sunlight across Biscayne Bay. Whitmore Holdings had reported its strongest quarterly governance score in company history. Independent oversight had become routine rather than reactive. What began as tension had matured into structure. In Midtown, the air carried the sharp cold of January. Inside Aurora's headquarters, the annual investor summit was underway. Pension fund managers, municipal representatives, and institutional partners filled the auditorium. Naomi stepped onto the stage without introduction fanfare. She did not require one. Capital, she began evenly, is not merely currency. It is confidence. And confidence must be protected. The room remained still. She spoke of oversight frameworks, ethical alignment, and long-term value preservation. She did not mention names. She did not narrate incidents. But everyone present understood that the standards she described were not theoretical. They had been tested. Across the country in Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore sat in a small co-working office reviewing early projections for a sustainable housing startup he had joined as a junior partner. The title was modest. The office was modest. The lessons were not. He no longer entered rooms expecting deference. He entered listening. One afternoon, his new colleague handed him a governance checklist. We do not move forward without this, she said plainly. Ethan nodded. Understood. The word carried more weight than it once had. Back in Manhattan, Richard Whitmore entered Aurora's headquarters for a scheduled review session. He moved through the lobby with quiet acknowledgement from reception staff. No longer defensive. No longer dismissive. He was greeted by Monica Hayes and escorted to a conference room, where Naomi waited. No photographers. No spectacle. Just two leaders across a table reviewing quarterly metrics. Your compliance liaison's report was thorough, Richard said as he opened his folder. We have implemented the recommended internal review cycles. Naomi nodded. Your board minutes reflect that, she replied. There was no edge in her voice now. Only evaluation. Richard looked up at her. You changed more than our governance, he said carefully. You changed our expectations of ourselves. Naomi paused briefly before responding. Expectation is where accountability begins, she said. The conversation moved to projections, risk diversification, and expansion strategy. It was business. Clear. Professional. Balanced. Outside, snow began to fall lightly over Midtown, softening the city's sharp edges. In Miami, construction crews finalized interior finishes of the first tower. Daniel Brooks stood on site during an inspection visit, reviewing progress reports with Margaret Ellis. 6 months ago, Daniel said quietly as they watched workers install floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought that night would destroy everything. Margaret adjusted her coat against the coastal breeze. Correction often looks like destruction at first, she replied. It is rarely the same thing. Daniel considered that as he looked up at the completed structure rising 35 stories into the sky. Back at Aurora's Investor Summit, a question-and-answer session began. A senior pension fund manager raised his hand. How do you determine when to suspend capital in the face of reputational risk? He asked. Naomi did not hesitate. When behavior suggests misalignment with long-term value, she answered. Short-term discomfort protects long-term trust. The room absorbed the clarity of it. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just principle articulated plainly. Later that evening, after the summit concluded, Naomi remained alone in her office reviewing final notes. The skyline shimmered in winter light. She thought briefly of that night months ago. The laughter. The assumption. The wine spreading across black fabric. She did not feel anger when she remembered it. She felt confirmation. A reminder that presence does not require announcement. It requires certainty. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Richard. Miami Tower 1 officially at 95% occupancy pre-launch, it read. She allowed herself a small nod before typing back. Sustainable alignment yields sustainable returns. In Los Angeles, Ethan attended a small governance seminar hosted by his new firm. The speaker discussed leadership responsibility in emerging markets. Authority is borrowed, the speaker said. It must be returned with interest. Ethan wrote the sentence down. He did not roll his eyes. He did not dismiss it. He listened. Weeks later, Whitmore Holdings held its annual shareholder meeting in a packed auditorium. Richard stood at the podium, Margaret Ellis seated to his left, Daniel Brooks 2 rows behind. This year, Richard began, we strengthened our internal oversight and reinforced our commitment to responsible leadership. He paused, looking out at the audience of investors and employees. We learned that confidence is not inherited. It is earned daily. Applause followed, steady and sincere. No one mentioned the dinner. No one needed to. The lesson had outgrown the incident. In Manhattan, Naomi walked once more through the lobby of Leclerc for a separate meeting. The maitre d' greeted her warmly. She acknowledged him with a slight nod and continued toward a private room where another executive team waited. As she entered, the room stood instinctively. Respect did not need to be requested. It had been established. She took her seat at the head of the table and began discussing renewable infrastructure projections. Her tone was calm, her posture steady. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual urgency. Deals were negotiated. Markets fluctuated. Names rose and fell. But in certain boardrooms, one principle had been permanently reinforced. That presence is not defined by appearance. That authority is not confirmed by volume. That capital, when guided by standards, does not tolerate careless assumptions. Months turned into a year. The Miami towers stood complete, their glass reflecting sunrise across the Atlantic. Whitmore Holdings governance reforms became case studies in business schools discussing reputational risk management. Aurora Capital continued expanding its portfolio across energy, housing, and infrastructure sectors. Naomi Carter's name appeared once again on financial magazine covers, not for confrontation, but for consistency. One evening, as she stood alone in her office overlooking Manhattan, She watched the lights flicker on across the skyline. She did not see buildings. She saw responsibility layered in steel and glass. Monica stepped in quietly. "Long day?" she asked. Naomi allowed a faint smile. "Productive," she replied. The snow had melted. The storm had passed. The structures remained. And somewhere in the quiet ledger of leadership, the cost of a single careless assumption had been fully reconciled, not through spectacle, but through steady correction, one decision at a time. "Respect is quiet," Naomi Carter said softly as she stood before the newly completed Miami Tower, its glass facade catching the late afternoon sun like a mirror held up to the sky. But its absence echoes. 1 year had passed since the night that recalibrated 2 companies in a single room. The development now stood fully operational, 35 stories of mixed-use design housing retail on the lower floors, office space above, and residential units overlooking the Atlantic. 98% occupancy. Waiting list for the remaining 2%. Whitmore Holdings had reported record stability ratings from independent analysts. Aurora Capital's oversight model was cited in financial journals as a benchmark for responsible partnership. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was modest compared to the original groundbreaking. No unnecessary spectacle. No exaggerated promises. Richard Whitmore stood at the podium beside Naomi, Margaret Ellis, and Daniel Brooks. He looked composed, not triumphant. "Today," he began, addressing a small audience of investors and city officials, "we celebrate not just completion, but correction, growth that required accountability." His words were measured, intentional. Naomi listened without expression. She did not need validation. She required alignment. After the ceremony, as guests dispersed across the polished lobby of the tower, Daniel approached Naomi with a quiet nod. "Full circle," he said. Naomi glanced toward the windows overlooking the bay. "Not full," she replied gently. "Forward." In Manhattan, Aurora Capital's annual report was being finalized. Monica Hayes entered Naomi's office carrying a bound draft. "Governance performance up 12% portfolio-wide," Monica reported. "Investor confidence metrics at a 5-year high." Naomi reviewed the summary pages carefully. "And Whitmore?" she asked. "Stable." "Independent board review passed unanimously," Monica replied. Naomi closed the report. "Good." Her tone carried neither pride nor relief. Only confirmation. Across the country in Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore stood at the back of a small conference room where his sustainable housing startup was presenting to a regional bank. He wore a simple navy suit. No cufflinks. No theatrics. When the bank's risk officer asked about internal compliance safeguards, Ethan answered carefully, referencing oversight protocols and independent advisory input. He did not rush. He did not interrupt. After the meeting, one of his colleagues clapped him on the shoulder. "You handled that well," she said. Ethan nodded quietly. He no longer mistook volume for authority. Back in Miami, Margaret Ellis conducted a final site review of the completed tower. She walked through the lobby where residents now moved comfortably between elevators and retail storefronts. She paused near a plaque mounted discreetly on the wall listing project partners. Whitmore Holdings, Aurora Capital, City of Miami. The names carried weight, but the weight felt balanced. Daniel joined her, tablet in hand. "Compliance metrics clean," he reported. Margaret nodded. "Sustainability verified?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Energy efficiency targets exceeded by 8%. Margaret allowed a faint smile. "Correction," she said quietly, "creates strength." In Manhattan that evening, Naomi returned to LeClaire for a private dinner with a different executive team, discussing an infrastructure expansion in Chicago. The same polished marble floors reflected the soft golden lighting. The same skyline shimmered beyond the windows. But the atmosphere was different. When she entered the room, every executive rose instinctively. Not out of fear, out of recognition. She took her seat at the head of the table and began reviewing projections. The conversation was precise, focused, respectful. At one point, a junior associate hesitated before presenting a revised forecast. Naomi listened fully before responding. "Clarity first," she said calmly. The associate nodded, reassured. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved steadily along Park Avenue. Inside, leadership moved without assumption. Later that night, as Naomi stepped into the cool air outside the restaurant, she paused briefly on the sidewalk. The city lights reflected in the windows above her. She remembered the sound of laughter from a year ago, not with resentment, with awareness. She had not needed to shout that night. She had not needed to prove herself with spectacle. She had adjusted the structure. In Whitmore's Manhattan headquarters the following morning, Richard addressed a room full of mid-level managers during a leadership workshop. Our responsibility, he said plainly, is not to protect ego. It is to protect integrity. The managers listened carefully. Margaret Ellis stood at the back of the room observing. Change had taken root not through humiliation, but through insistence on alignment. In Los Angeles, Ethan attended another governance seminar. This time he asked questions. Direct ones. How do you correct perception once it has shifted? He asked the speaker. The response was measured. You do not correct perception. You correct behavior. Perception follows. Ethan wrote that down as well. Months later, Aurora Capital expanded its portfolio into renewable infrastructure in Texas. During a press conference, a reporter asked Naomi whether her firm's strict oversight approach ever risked losing profitable deals. She answered without hesitation. If a deal requires compromised standards, she said, it is not profitable. The statement circulated quietly in financial circles. Not controversial, just firm. In Miami, the completed tower hosted its first major community event, a charity fundraiser benefiting local housing initiatives. Richard and Naomi stood on opposite sides of the room, speaking with city leaders and residents. There was no visible tension between them, only professionalism. At one point, Richard approached Naomi near the balcony overlooking the water. I used to think correction meant loss, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked out over the illuminated bay. Correction means survival, she replied. He nodded once, understanding now in a way he had not before. As the evening concluded, guests exited beneath soft string lights, the Atlantic breeze gentle against the building's glass exterior. Inside the lobby, Daniel paused by the plaque listing project partners once more. He remembered sitting silently at a dinner table months earlier, uncertain whether to speak. He no longer hesitated in rooms where misalignment appeared. Back in Manhattan, Naomi stood alone in her office at the end of the week, watching as dusk settled over the skyline. The city never stopped moving. Markets never paused for reflection. But she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness. Power had not needed to announce itself that night. It had simply required precision. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Richard. Miami Tower 2 approved, it read. She typed back a single sentence. Proceed with alignment. She set the phone down and looked out across the city once more. Steel and glass rose in every direction, symbols of ambition and opportunity. But she understood something many did not. Structures were not sustained by height alone. They were sustained by foundation. And foundation was not built in public ceremonies or glossy reports. It was built in the quiet moment when someone chose standards over convenience. The laughter from that long-ago dinner had faded into memory. The alignment that followed had become structure. And in boardrooms across Manhattan, Miami, and beyond, the echo of that correction remained, steady and unmistakable, reminding every room that respect is quiet, but its absence is never invisible. The difference between power and noise, Naomi Carter said quietly during a closed-door strategy session at Aurora Capital, is that power does not need an audience. 2 years had passed since the night that reshaped a partnership and recalibrated a legacy. The Miami towers were now fully integrated into the city skyline, their glass facades reflecting sunrise and sunset across Biscayne Bay with quiet permanence. Whitmore Holdings had expanded into 2 additional developments under the same oversight structure that had once felt intrusive and now felt indispensable. Aurora Capital's governance model had become a case study at Columbia Business School, discussed in lecture halls where future executives debated risk, accountability, and leverage. In Manhattan, early spring light filtered through the tall windows of Aurora's executive boardroom as Naomi reviewed a new acquisition proposal involving transit infrastructure in Chicago. Monica Hayes stood beside the digital display outlining projected returns. Risk exposure moderate, Monica said. Cultural alignment assessment pending. Naomi nodded. Schedule the alignment interviews before capital allocation, she replied. No one in the room questioned the sequence. It had become standard practice. Across town, Whitmore Holdings hosted a quarterly leadership forum for its senior managers. Richard Whitmore stood at the front of the room, no longer carrying the quiet defensiveness he once had. "We built structures," he said plainly. "But we now understand that structure includes conduct." The managers listened attentively. Behind them, a slide projected updated governance metrics and compliance benchmarks. Daniel Brooks, now serving as Director of Governance Integration, facilitated breakout discussions on oversight procedures. His confidence was steady. He no longer occupied the margins of meetings. He guided them. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore presented his sustainable housing project at a regional urban development conference. He spoke about responsible financing, community engagement, and long-term accountability. His tone was measured, his posture grounded. Afterward, a young entrepreneur approached him. "You speak differently than most legacy developers," she observed. Ethan offered a small nod. "Experience adjusts you," he replied. In Manhattan, Naomi concluded the Chicago infrastructure call with a final sentence that settled across the room like a quiet standard. "We do not enter rooms to be welcomed," she said. "We enter to evaluate." The committee members nodded. The meeting adjourned. Later that afternoon, she received an invitation to speak at a National Economic Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. The topic assigned to her panel was capital responsibility in evolving markets. She accepted without hesitation. Weeks later, standing beneath the soft lighting of a conference hall in Washington, she addressed an audience of policymakers, investors, and corporate executives. "Capital," she said, her voice even and deliberate, "is a reflection of trust. Trust must be guarded before it is granted." She did not recount past events. She did not dramatize experience. She spoke in principles. The room absorbed her clarity. After the session, a senator approached her. "Your approach prevented what could have been a larger collapse," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze calmly. "Prevention is rarely visible," she replied, "but it is measurable." Back in Miami, Margaret Ellis conducted a compliance anniversary review at the completed towers. She walked through the lobby where residents moved freely between retail spaces and residential elevators. She paused beside the governance plaque once more, not to admire it, to confirm it still represented something real. Daniel joined her with updated occupancy data. "Second tower now at 93%, he reported. Margaret nodded. "Stability," she said softly. In Manhattan that evening, Naomi returned once again to L'Eau Claire for a separate engagement. The marble floors gleamed under golden light. The maitre d' greeted her by name. When she entered the private dining room, every executive rose automatically, not out of obligation, out of recognition. She took her seat and began reviewing a renewable energy proposal. The conversation remained disciplined, respectful, aligned. No assumptions lingered in the air. After dinner, as she stepped back onto the Manhattan sidewalk, a light rain began to fall, reflecting city lights across wet pavement. She paused briefly, recalling how differently that same entrance had once felt. Not hostile, but revealing. Across the country, Ethan completed a governance certification program and returned to New York for a brief visit. He requested a meeting with his father. They sat across from one another in Richard's Midtown office overlooking the skyline. "I did not understand consequence," Ethan admitted quietly. Richard listened without interruption. "I know," he replied. There was no anger in his voice, only realism. "You do now?" Richard added. Ethan nodded once. "Yes." In Aurora's headquarters, Monica entered Naomi's office with a news alert displayed on her tablet. "Whitmore Holdings named in top 10 most improved governance rankings," she reported. Naomi glanced briefly at the headline before returning to her documents. "Improvement," she said, "is only meaningful if it continues." Monica smiled faintly. "They know that now." As months continued, Aurora Capital expanded further into public infrastructure and clean energy, applying the same alignment protocols that had once felt controversial. Other firms began adopting similar models, citing measurable risk reduction and increased investor confidence. Naomi did not seek credit. She saw consistency. One autumn evening, as she stood alone in her office overlooking a city glowing in amber twilight, she reflected on the quiet recalibration that had begun with a single careless assumption. No public apology had defined the outcome. No dramatic confrontation had concluded it. Instead, there had been leverage, then alignment, then structure. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Richard. "Chicago infrastructure approved. Board unanimous," it read. She responded with 2 words. Proceed responsibly. She set the phone down and looked once more across the skyline, steel and glass layered against the fading light. Power did not echo through raised voices or visible retaliation. It settled into frameworks. It embedded itself in policies. It reshaped expectations quietly. In Manhattan, Miami, Los Angeles, and beyond, rooms had adjusted. And in that adjustment, a new standard had taken root, not because it demanded attention, but because it demanded alignment. Legacy is not what you inherit, Naomi Carter said quietly during Aurora Capital's third annual Governance and Growth Forum. It is what survives your decisions. 3 years had passed since the evening that had quietly redefined 2 companies and altered the trajectory of multiple careers. Manhattan's skyline continued its steady evolution, new towers rising between older structures, steel layered against sky like ambition written in glass. Aurora Capital had expanded into transportation infrastructure, renewable energy corridors in Texas, and mixed-income housing in the Midwest. Its oversight model, once considered firm, was now described in industry journals as foundational. Inside the glass auditorium overlooking the Hudson River, institutional investors filled every seat. Pension boards from California, municipal representatives from Illinois, and private equity partners from across the country had gathered not for spectacle, but for clarity. Naomi stood at the center of the stage in a tailored charcoal suit, hands resting lightly on the podium. Sustainable return, she continued evenly, requires sustainable leadership. Governance is not an accessory to growth. It is the framework that holds it upright. The audience remained silent, attentive. Many had studied Aurora's case files. They knew the moment years ago when a major development nearly faltered under misjudged behavior. They understood the recalibration that followed. Naomi did not recount the incident. She spoke instead about risk assessment algorithms, oversight committees, and long-term accountability metrics. The lesson had matured beyond narrative. Across Manhattan, Whitmore Holdings headquarters felt different than it had in the past. The lobby displayed updated transparency reports alongside project renderings. Compliance updates were circulated monthly, not quarterly. Richard Whitmore moved through the corridors with measured awareness. His voice carried authority still, but it was tempered by something steadier. Experience had replaced assumption. In the executive conference room, Margaret Ellis presented a governance impact analysis to the board. Independent oversight has reduced liability exposure by 14% year over year, she stated clearly. Daniel Brooks, now serving as Chief Governance Officer, projected updated metrics onto the screen. Leadership review cycles have improved executive accountability scores across all divisions, he added. The board listened closely. No one dismissed the data as procedural. It had become part of their foundation. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore stood before a modest group of city planners presenting his sustainable housing initiative. The venue was smaller than the Manhattan auditoriums he once frequented. The room did not carry inherited prestige. It carried scrutiny. Ethan welcomed it. We built compliance into our first round of financing, he explained calmly. Independent advisors review each phase before capital is deployed. The planners nodded, taking notes. Afterward, one of them approached him. You seem very focused on governance, she observed. Ethan offered a brief, knowing smile. Experience teaches alignment, he replied. Back in Manhattan, Naomi concluded her keynote with a sentence that lingered in the air long after she stepped away from the podium. When standards are applied consistently, she said, power becomes predictable. Applause followed, not thunderous, but sustained. Investors valued predictability. Later that afternoon, Naomi returned to her office. The late autumn light filtered softly through the tall windows, casting long shadows across polished floors. Monica Hayes entered with updated portfolio summaries. Whitmore's Chicago infrastructure project ahead of schedule, she reported. Board oversight ratings remained strong. Naomi nodded once. And the Miami properties? She asked. Full occupancy maintained, Monica replied. Naomi turned toward the skyline. The city stretched outward in steel and glass, each building representing negotiation, risk, ambition. She did not see monuments. She saw responsibility. Weeks later, Aurora Capital released its annual performance report. Headlines in financial publications referenced stable growth and disciplined oversight. One article described Naomi as a quiet architect of corporate recalibration. She read the phrase once before setting the paper aside. Architecture required blueprints. Correction required resolve. In Whitmore's boardroom, Richard addressed his executive team during a strategic planning session. "We no longer assume stability," he said plainly. "We build it." The executives nodded, reviewing quarterly compliance dashboards displayed on the screen. Daniel facilitated the discussion with clarity and precision. He had once been the quiet observer at the edge of the table. Now he shaped the agenda. Across the country, Ethan returned to Manhattan for a family visit during the holidays. The skyline shimmered in winter lights as he stood beside his father in the penthouse office overlooking Park Avenue. "I was not prepared for consequence," Ethan admitted quietly. Richard looked at him, not with frustration, but with realism. "Few people are," he replied, "until they meet it." The exchange did not carry tension. It carried growth. Months passed. Aurora Capital's renewable energy portfolio expanded into Arizona, backed by rigorous compliance audits. Naomi personally reviewed the cultural alignment assessments before approving final capital tranches. No decision moved without evaluation. At a regional economic summit in Chicago, Naomi joined a panel discussing infrastructure funding. A journalist asked her whether strict oversight ever limited opportunity. She answered without hesitation. "Opportunity without alignment is liability," she said calmly. The statement circulated across financial news feeds by evening. In Miami, the towers stood illuminated against the Atlantic night sky, their glass facades reflecting city lights like quiet confirmations of stability. Residents moved through the lobby beneath a discreet plaque listing project partners. Whitmore Holdings. Aurora Capital. The names no longer suggested tension. They suggested balance. Margaret Ellis completed her 4th annual governance review and submitted her findings. "Embedded accountability," she wrote in the summary. Daniel read the report carefully before forwarding it to Richard with a single note. Sustained. One evening in Manhattan, Naomi returned again to Le Claire for a private infrastructure negotiation. The maitre d' greeted her with steady respect. When she entered the private dining room, executives rose automatically. The conversation unfolded with discipline and clarity. No assumptions drifted through the air. After the meeting concluded, Naomi stepped outside into the crisp evening air. Snow fell lightly across the city, settling on sidewalks and streetlights. She paused for a brief moment, recalling how quietly a single decision had reshaped entire frameworks. It had not required spectacle. It had required precision. Back at Aurora's headquarters, Monica updated quarterly performance metrics. Portfolio governance compliance at an all-time high, she reported during the executive session. Naomi listened, then responded simply, "Maintain it." In Los Angeles, Ethan closed a financing round for his housing project under strict oversight conditions. He signed the documents with a steady hand, aware of what discipline meant now. Across Manhattan, Miami, Chicago, and beyond, the recalibration that began years earlier had matured into standard practice. The laughter that once echoed in a private dining room had long faded. What remained was structure, alignment, foundation. And in boardrooms across the country, an unspoken understanding lingered quietly. Respect is not requested. It is recognized. And once recognized, it reshapes every room it enters. Correction is not an event, Naomi Carter said during Aurora Capital's 5th annual leadership retreat, her voice steady against the backdrop of a clear Manhattan morning. It is a culture. 5 years had passed since a single evening recalibrated more than a partnership. Manhattan's skyline had grown denser, layered with new glass towers reflecting ambition and capital. Aurora Capital now managed infrastructure corridors across the Midwest, renewable energy grids in the Southwest, and mixed-income developments in 3 major coastal cities. Governance was no longer a departmental function. It was embedded in every proposal before the first dollar moved. Inside the executive retreat room overlooking the Hudson River, senior partners reviewed a decade of performance metrics. Monica Hayes stood beside the digital display, summarizing portfolio stability. Volatility reduced across all major holdings, she reported. Independent oversight compliance maintained at 99%. Naomi nodded once. Maintain 100, she replied evenly. No one in the room interpreted it as criticism. It was standard. Across town, Whitmore Holdings prepared to announce its largest expansion yet, a transportation hub redevelopment in partnership with municipal authorities. Richard Whitmore stood at the podium during the press briefing, composed and deliberate. "We have learned that long-term growth depends on disciplined oversight," he said clearly. "Our structure reflects that commitment." Margaret Ellis stood near the back of the room, observing quietly. Daniel Brooks, now Executive Vice President of Governance and Strategy, reviewed the press materials before distribution. Nothing left the building without alignment. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore finalized plans for his sustainable housing project's second phase. The development, modest but respected, had earned praise for its compliance, transparency, and community involvement. Ethan had grown into a quieter presence, one that listened before speaking. During a stakeholder meeting, a community representative asked about oversight safeguards. Ethan answered calmly. "Independent review is built into every stage," he said. "Accountability is part of the design." Back in Manhattan, Aurora Capital convened a private board session to evaluate a potential acquisition involving a multi-state transit system. The financial upside was significant. The governance structure of the target company was not. Naomi listened as analysts outlined the revenue projections. When they finished, she asked one question. "Does their leadership demonstrate alignment?" The room paused. Data filled the screen. Compliance irregularities appeared in small print. Naomi leaned back slightly. "Then revenue is irrelevant," she said quietly. The decision was unanimous. Aurora declined the deal. No press release announced the refusal. But within investment circles, the message was understood. In Miami, the Twin Towers now stood as established fixtures in the skyline, their occupancy rate stable, their community impact measurable. Residents moved through the lobby beneath warm lighting and polished floors. The plaque listing project partners remained unchanged. Whitmore Holdings, Aurora Capital, City of Miami. Stability had replaced spectacle. One evening, Richard invited Naomi to a private dinner at a different venue, overlooking the East River. The atmosphere was professional, not tense. As they reviewed new transportation proposals, Richard paused. "There was a time I would have interpreted your discipline as hostility," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked at him evenly. "Discipline protects," she replied. "Hostility destroys." He nodded, understanding now that distinction fully. Years earlier, he might have bristled at the correction. Now he valued it. In Washington, D.C., Naomi testified before a Congressional Economic Subcommittee discussing infrastructure investment safeguards. Her voice remained measured under the bright committee lights. "Public-private partnerships require transparent leadership," she said clearly. "Capital must serve communities, not just shareholders." Lawmakers listened closely. Her reputation carried weight not because she demanded attention, but because her standards had proven resilient. In Los Angeles, Ethan completed the second phase of his housing development under strict regulatory compliance. During the ribbon cutting, he spoke briefly. "We build with oversight from the beginning," he said. The statement was simple, but it carried lived understanding. In Manhattan, Daniel facilitated a cross-portfolio governance summit at Whitmore Holdings, inviting compliance officers from each division to share best practices. "Correction is not memory," he said during the opening session. "It is maintenance." The phrase resonated across the room. Years earlier, Daniel had watched silently as assumption filled a room. Now he guided conversations that prevented it. Autumn returned to Manhattan, casting amber light across the skyline. In Aurora's headquarters, Monica presented updated investor confidence metrics. "Institutional trust remains at record levels," she reported. Naomi reviewed the data carefully before responding. "Trust is rented," she said, "not owned." The sentence lingered. Later that week, Aurora Capital celebrated its 20th anniversary with a modest gathering of partners and stakeholders. No extravagant displays. No unnecessary theatrics. Naomi addressed the room briefly. "We measure success not by size," she said, "but by sustainability." Applause followed, steady and respectful. Across the river, Richard watched the city lights reflect against dark water from his office window. He thought about the trajectory of his company over the past 5 years. Growth had continued, but it had become steadier, less volatile. He understood now that discipline had strengthened legacy rather than diminished it. His phone vibrated softly. A message from Naomi. Transportation Hub approved pending compliance audit, it read. He responded with a simple acknowledgement. Aligned. In Miami, Margaret completed her annual governance audit and submitted her report. The conclusion was concise. Embedded accountability sustained. Daniel forwarded the report to Richard with a brief note. Foundation secure. In Manhattan, Naomi returned once more to Le Claire for a private infrastructure negotiation. The marble floors gleamed under warm lighting. When she entered the room, executives stood instinctively. She took her seat and began reviewing projections. The conversation was calm, measured, aligned. No one in the room confused silence with weakness. Outside, snow began to fall lightly over the city, dusting sidewalks and rooftops in white. Naomi paused briefly before stepping into her car. The skyline stretched upward around her, layered in steel and glass. 5 years earlier, a single careless assumption had echoed in a private room. What followed was not spectacle, but structure. Not retaliation, but recalibration. Power had not needed to shout. It had needed to decide. And in boardrooms across Manhattan, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, the echo of that decision remained steady, embedded in policy, in culture, in expectation. Correction had become culture. Alignment had become standard. And legacy, once assumed, had been rebuilt one deliberate choice at a time. Time does not erase a lesson, Naomi Carter said quietly as she stood before the panoramic windows of Aurora Capitals. New global headquarters in Lower Manhattan. It reveals whether it was learned. 10 years had passed since the moment that shifted more than a partnership. The skyline outside had evolved again, glass towers reflecting a decade of expansion and recalibration. Aurora Capital now managed multi-state transportation networks, renewable energy grids stretching across the Southwest, and urban redevelopment initiatives in cities once considered too volatile for long-term investment. Its governance model was no longer a case study. It was a benchmark adopted by firms that once resisted oversight. Inside the executive boardroom, senior partners gathered for the firm's 10-year strategic review. Monica Hayes, now Chief Operating Officer, projected long-term stability metrics across a digital display. Portfolio volatility reduced by 30% over the last decade, she reported. Institutional confidence at historic highs. Governance audits passed without exception for 9 consecutive years. Naomi listened without visible reaction. Sustained consistency, she said evenly. The phrase carried more weight than celebration. Across town, Whitmore Holdings prepared for its centennial anniversary. Richard Whitmore, older now but steady, stood in the company's renovated headquarters where portraits of past executives lined the walls. A new portrait had been added in recent years. Not of him, not of his father, but of the board restructuring that had marked a turning point in the company's history. It was not a person. It was a principle. During a rehearsal for the anniversary event, Daniel Brooks reviewed the final presentation slides. He had become president of Whitmore Holdings 5 years earlier after Richard transitioned into an advisory role. The governance transformation slide stays, Daniel told the communications team. It is part of our story. No one argued. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore walked through a completed sustainable housing community bearing his company's name. Children rode bicycles along landscaped paths. Solar panels lined rooftops. The development had received national recognition for environmental and financial responsibility. Ethan paused near a community center plaque listing oversight partners and compliance certifications. He touched the edge of the plaque briefly, not as a gesture of pride, but acknowledgement. Years earlier, he would have dismissed such details. Now he built around them. Back in Manhattan, Aurora Capital convened a private international summit with European and Asian infrastructure partners. Naomi addressed the room with calm authority. Expansion without alignment multiplies risk, she said. We grow only where leadership reflects accountability. A representative from a European investment group nodded. Your model has influenced regulatory frameworks abroad, he remarked. Naomi responded simply. Standards travel. After the summit, she returned to her office overlooking the harbor. The Statue of Liberty stood in the distance, small but steady against the horizon. She thought briefly of the first time she had been dismissed in a boardroom decades earlier. The memory did not sting anymore. It steadied her. Across the East River, Whitmore Holdings' centennial celebration began in a renovated warehouse overlooking the skyline. Investors, employees, and civic leaders gathered beneath suspended lights and projected archival images. Richard stepped onto the stage first, his voice measured. "Legacy," he said, "is not inherited. It is corrected." The audience remained quiet. He gestured toward Daniel, who joined him at the podium. Daniel spoke about transformation, transparency, and the discipline that had reshaped the company's culture. "We do not hide our inflection points," Daniel said. "We honor them." Applause followed, sustained and sincere. Naomi attended the event quietly, seated near the back of the room. She did not seek acknowledgement. When Daniel concluded, he glanced toward her briefly, a silent recognition of the alignment that had begun years earlier. Later that evening, Richard approached her near the harbor windows. "You forced us to confront ourselves," he said softly. Naomi met his gaze calmly. "You chose to," she replied. He nodded. "That choice saved us." In Los Angeles, Ethan watched a live stream of the centennial celebration from his office. When he heard his father's words about correction, he sat back slowly. The arc of consequence had become clarity. He sent a brief message to Daniel. "Proud of what you built." Daniel responded minutes later. "We built it." Months later, Aurora Capital entered a partnership to rebuild critical infrastructure in a coastal city affected by climate damage. The project required strict environmental oversight and transparent community engagement. Naomi insisted on additional compliance reviews before capital release. "Impact must match intention," she told her team. The statement echoed through meeting minutes and investor briefings. In Washington, policymakers cited Aurora's framework during a national infrastructure reform debate. The model had outgrown its origin. It had become expectation. One winter evening, Naomi returned again to L'Eau Claire for a quiet dinner with a new generation of executives. The marble floors gleamed beneath warm light. When she entered, the room stood instinctively. She took her seat without ceremony and began reviewing projections. The conversation unfolded with discipline, clarity, and mutual respect. No one in the room underestimated presence. After dinner, she stepped outside into the cold Manhattan air. Snow drifted lightly across the sidewalk. The skyline rose around her, layered in light and shadow. 10 years earlier, a single careless assumption had revealed more than arrogance. It had revealed fragility. What followed had not been revenge. It had been recalibration. Power had not shouted. It had decided. And in boardrooms across Manhattan, Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, and beyond, the quiet architecture of that decision endured. Correction had become culture. Governance had become identity. And legacy, once assumed permanent, had been strengthened by the simple refusal to tolerate misalignment. As Naomi stood beneath the city lights, she understood something that younger executives were only beginning to grasp. Respect is not enforced by volume. It is enforced by standards. And standards, once set, reshape every room they enter without ever needing to raise their voice. The true measure of power, Naomi Carter said quietly as she addressed Aurora Capital's next-generation leadership cohort, is what remains steady when no one is testing you. 15 years had passed since a single evening revealed the cost of assumption and the strength of alignment. Manhattan's skyline had continued to evolve, towers rising and settling into the horizon like silent witnesses to decisions made behind glass walls. Aurora Capital now operated on 3 continents, overseeing infrastructure systems that moved millions of people daily, renewable grids powering entire regions, and urban housing initiatives that balanced profitability with responsibility. Its governance framework was studied globally, translated into policy language, embedded in international investment agreements. Inside the firm's executive training auditorium, young associates and future partners sat in disciplined silence as Naomi spoke without theatrics. "You will enter rooms where your presence is questioned," she said evenly. "You will encounter assumption disguised as confidence. Do not respond with volume. Respond with standards." The words settled into the room with weight, earned over years of consistency. Monica Hayes, now president of Aurora Capital, stood near the back observing the cohort. She had watched Naomi enforce alignment long before it became industry language. She understood that culture was not created in keynote speeches. It was reinforced in decisions made quietly. Across town, Whitmore Holdings had completed its largest infrastructure project to date, a regional transportation network connecting 3 metropolitan areas. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was deliberate and measured. Daniel Brooks, now Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Holdings, stood at the podium. Richard Whitmore sat in the front row as Chairman Emeritus, his posture steady, his expression reflective rather than commanding. Our history includes moments of correction, Daniel said clearly to the assembled officials and investors. We do not conceal them. We learn from them. Applause followed, not out of obligation, but respect. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore walked through the 3rd phase of his sustainable housing initiative, now expanded into 2 additional states. He paused in a community courtyard where families gathered beneath shade trees planted during the project's initial phase. A young project manager approached him with updated compliance metrics. All inspections cleared ahead of schedule, she reported. Ethan reviewed the numbers carefully. Maintain it, he said calmly. The phrase no longer belonged to someone else. It had become part of his discipline. Back in Manhattan, Aurora Capital prepared to announce a global partnership with a consortium of European infrastructure funds. The due diligence process had lasted 18 months. Cultural alignment interviews had been conducted across 5 countries. Governance structures were scrutinized line by line. During the final board meeting, one international partner asked Naomi why Aurora insisted on such exhaustive oversight. She answered without hesitation. Because growth without structure collapses under its own weight, she said. The partnership was approved unanimously. That evening, Naomi returned once more to the quiet marble entrance of Leclerc. The restaurant had changed management over the years, but the polished floors and panoramic skyline remained familiar. She was not there for negotiation. She was meeting a young founder seeking mentorship. When she entered the private dining room, the founder stood immediately, nervous but prepared. Thank you for meeting me, the founder said. Naomi took her seat calmly. Tell me about your governance structure, she replied. The founder blinked in surprise. We are still small, he said. Naomi held his gaze. Start small, she said. But start aligned. Outside, the Manhattan skyline shimmered against the darkening sky. Snow drifted lightly once again, echoing winter's past. The city had no memory of individual dinners. It remembered impact. Across the river, Whitmore Holdings hosted a leadership workshop for new hires. Daniel addressed the room directly. Authority is not inherited, he said. It is sustained through conduct. The trainees listened carefully. On a side wall, a timeline displayed the company's milestones. One marker simply read governance transformation. It did not mention dates. It did not mention conflict. It marked recalibration. In Los Angeles, Ethan received an invitation to speak at a regional development forum on responsible expansion. During his presentation, he referenced independent oversight and community accountability. I learned that alignment must come before ambition, he said. The audience nodded. The statement carried authenticity. Months later, Aurora Capital's global partnership launched successfully, stabilizing transit networks across multiple European cities. International media highlighted the firm's disciplined approach to risk. Naomi declined interviews focused on personality. She accepted those centered on policy. Systems outlast individuals, she said during one broadcast. Build systems. In Miami, the Twin Towers continued to operate at full capacity, now surrounded by additional developments inspired by their structure. Residents moved through the lobby beneath the plaque listing project partners. The names had not changed. The meaning had deepened. Margaret Ellis, now retired, visited the property during a quiet afternoon. She stood briefly in the lobby observing the steady flow of residents and employees. Daniel joined her, smiling. Foundation holds, he said softly. She nodded. Because it was reinforced, she replied. In Manhattan, Aurora Capital celebrated its 30th anniversary with a private gathering of partners, policymakers, and community leaders. Naomi stood before them without dramatic lighting or grand music. We did not grow by demanding respect, she said. We grew by defining it. The room remained still, absorbing the simplicity of the statement. Later that evening, as guests departed and the city lights flickered against the Hudson River, Naomi stood alone near the windows of her office. The skyline rose before her, layered in steel, memory, and momentum. 15 years earlier, She had sat quietly in a private room while laughter filled the air. She had not raised her voice. She had adjusted the structure. The decision that followed had echoed far beyond one partnership. It had reshaped companies, careers, and expectations. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Daniel. Transportation network ahead of projections. Oversight metrics clean. She responded with a single line. Maintain alignment. She set the phone down and looked out across Manhattan one final time that evening. Power had never required spectacle. It required clarity. Respect had never required demand. It required standards. And in boardrooms across cities and continents, the quiet architecture of those standards endured, steady and unmistakable, reminding every room that alignment is not optional, and dignity, once defended with precision, becomes permanent. The room always remembers, Naomi Carter said softly as she stood alone in the executive lounge of Aurora Capital's global headquarters, the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Even when the people forget, 20 years had passed since a single evening exposed assumption and demanded alignment. The city outside had transformed in visible ways, new towers rising, old facades replaced, transit lines expanded, neighborhoods redefined. But the most enduring structures were invisible. They lived in policy, in board minutes, in the quiet expectation that conduct must match authority. Aurora Capital now operated across 4 continents, overseeing infrastructure systems that connected millions of lives each day. Renewable grids powered entire regions. Housing initiatives balanced profitability with community stability. International regulators referenced Aurora's governance architecture as foundational language in investment treaties. What began as discipline had matured into doctrine. Inside the firm's executive boardroom, a new generation of partners gathered around a 20-foot glass table. Monica Hayes, now chairwoman of the board, reviewed succession plans projected across a digital display. Naomi sat at the head of the table, not because she demanded the position, but because it had long been understood. Leadership transition must reflect continuity, Monica said. Our culture does not shift with titles. Naomi nodded slightly. Culture only shifts when standards weaken. She replied evenly. No one in the room interpreted it as warning. It was reminder. Across the city, Whitmore Holdings prepared to announce a multi-city expansion into resilient coastal infrastructure. Daniel Brooks stood before a press conference as chief executive officer, steady and composed. Richard Whitmore, now retired fully from public role, watched from the front row with quiet satisfaction. Our growth, Daniel said clearly, is built on oversight and transparency. We learned early that alignment is not optional. The audience listened without skepticism. The company's transformation had become its identity. In Los Angeles, Ethan Whitmore addressed a graduating class at a regional university's business school. He stood without arrogance, without inherited confidence, but with earned clarity. You will be tested when you believe no one is evaluating you, he told the students. That is when you define yourself. He did not reference the moment that had reshaped his path. He did not need to. The lesson lived in his discipline. Back in Manhattan, Aurora Capital finalized a global infrastructure alliance involving partners from Europe, Asia, and South America. The negotiation process had lasted 2 years. Cultural alignment audits were conducted across time zones and languages. Compliance frameworks were harmonized before capital was released. During the final signing ceremony, an international delegate leaned toward Naomi. Your firm insists on standards others consider excessive, he observed. Naomi met his gaze calmly. Excessive stability is preferable to preventable collapse, she replied. The agreement was signed without hesitation. That evening, Naomi returned once more to the familiar marble floors of Leclerc, not for negotiation, not for correction, but for reflection. The restaurant had renovated its interior over the years, but the skyline view remained unchanged. She requested a private room and sat alone at a table overlooking the city lights. No wine was poured. No voices rose. The quiet was intentional. She remembered not the embarrassment of that distant night, but the clarity that followed. She had not demanded apology. She had not raised her voice. She had exercised leverage with precision. The decision had traveled far beyond a single partnership. It had reshaped companies, leaders, expectations. Outside, snow fell gently across Manhattan, settling along sidewalks and rooftops in a familiar winter rhythm. Across the East River, Whitmore Holdings headquarters glowed under soft light. Daniel reviewed quarterly oversight metrics one final time before leaving his office. He paused at the framed timeline mounted on the wall. One marker still read governance transformation. It did not list conflict. It listed correction. He turned off the lights and stepped into the elevator with quiet certainty. In Los Angeles, Ethan walked through his largest completed development to date, now spanning 3 states. Families gathered in community courtyards. Solar panels reflected the evening sun. He paused near a plaque listing compliance certifications and oversight partners. He had once overlooked such details. Now he saw them as foundation. In Washington, D.C., policymakers referenced Aurora Capital's model during a national infrastructure reform hearing. The language of alignment had entered legislation. Naomi watched the broadcast briefly from her office before returning to her work. Influence did not require applause. It required endurance. Weeks later, Aurora Capital announced Naomi Carter's transition into a strategic advisory role after decades at the helm. The announcement was measured, not dramatic. Monica addressed the global team via live broadcast. "Standards remain unchanged," she said clearly. Naomi stepped forward briefly. "Titles evolve," she said evenly. "Principles do not." The broadcast ended without fanfare. In Manhattan, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond, boardrooms continued to operate under frameworks once considered strict and now considered necessary. Alignment was no longer reactionary. It was embedded. One final winter evening, Naomi stood on the balcony of her Manhattan apartment overlooking the river. The skyline shimmered in layered light, each building representing ambition shaped by decision. She reflected not on the humiliation that began it all, but on the discipline that followed. Power had not required volume. It had required certainty. Respect had not required demand. It had required enforcement through standards. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Daniel. New coastal project approved. Oversight unanimous. She smiled faintly before replying. Maintain it. She set the phone down and looked across the city one last time that night. The room always remembers. Even when individuals change, even when years pass, even when new leaders rise. It remembers who upheld standards and who ignored them. It remembers who confused silence for weakness and who understood silence as strength. And in the quiet architecture of steel, glass, and policy that now defines cities across continents, the legacy of one deliberate decision endured, steady and permanent, reminding every boardroom it entered that dignity defended with precision becomes power that never needs to speak loudly again.